Hey, welcome to the Everyday Rabbi.
Thanks for having me.
This is new and improved. Never been done before.
First time.
First time. So how are you? What's your name?
Mendy Dubov. I'm your brother.
How long do we know each other?
You know me longer than I know you, actually.
Probably.
30 years on Friday.
Right. It slips in there somewhere. Like you don't really remember when I became your brother, but that happens. So what are we doing here? What's this all about? I think that this is years in the making. I think this is something which we talked about doing, both you and I. I know you had your own thing. I've been focusing on doing something like this for a very long time. And the inspiration, which we talked about, many times before, is to really share conversations that happen behind closed doors. We were talking earlier, before we started filming about how, we have a conversation at home. It's all of our brothers. We're all sitting around. We're all chatting. We're all, if you don't have a loud enough voice with enough confidence, you can't get your word in edgewise.
You don't get any airtime.
Zero. So, but it's also, we talked about how it's a debate in order to learn something, and we're each trying to better ourselves in our own way. And we could talk about where we got that philosophy from, but the between the 9 of us, I think that I sort of took a primary role in being the third parent in the family and trying to motivate my siblings to have all the keys to success that they need to be successful and to learn and to discover and so on. I think that we've done a good job. So every one of us has our own style, our own way, and I think that as a microcosm is sort of what happens on a daily basis in your life and my life, both as rabbis, both as community leaders, you in your area and, my own, and our circles of influence, our circles of friends. And there's conversations that tend to happen on a public stage, on a public forum, that don't really happen.
You're saying conversations that should be had that nobody hears.
That part of that, and also conversations that happen that you wish more people would hear. Right. And there's just isn't a set, a studio, a mic, a camera's rolling, and sometimes I'll be 45 minutes into a conversation with somebody I just met and be like, why isn't this being recorded? Because first of all, because it's easier to have it recorded and than say it over and over.
To walk around with like a microphone everywhere.
We're big fans of Rabbi Manis Friedman, and someone once asked Manis, why do you say the same thing over and over? And he says, until people get the message, I'll say it over and over. In other words, we tend to say the things that we think are most important until people get it. And I guess we feel that most people don't get it. So the question is, what is there to get, and what really is it that makes us tick, and how did we end up here in the first place? We're both from Orlando. So I think that we have a perspective.
It shocks people. By the way.
It shocks people. Just number one, because it's Orlando. And number two, because we sort of grew up in a desert. We grew up in an oasis of Judaism. There was no nothing Jewish when we grew up. I mean, we were the only Jewish Torah observant family for like 100-mile radius, which sounds crazy to say today because there's many, many more, but this was going back 40 years. A lot's happened since then. But I think that the point being that we, I think, have a different perspective, a fresher perspective, because it's raw, unedited Judaism. It wasn't like it had to go through 5 filters in order to get to us. Literally, the education we got from our parents is the education that we have today. It had to be very authentic. It had to be very real because they had to live it. And we lived in the rabbi's house. We always talk about, what must have it been like to live in the Rebbe Rashab's house, or the Tzemach Tzedek's house, or the house of Moses, and so on. Same analogy. You would have had a lot more data, a lot more inspiration, a lot more to live with naturally. There's 1,000 examples of this. Things that, again, maybe we can't even experience this on a podcast, but like searching for chametz the night before Pesach. Like a lot of Balei Tshuva, a lot of people who come to Judaism and become more observant later on in life, if they didn't grow up with that, they would never have that. And I remember we had one guy, he's a good friend of ours. He became more observant, actually went through a conversion. And at one point I realized this, and I said, you know what? I'm going to teach you how I learned how to search for chametz. And I take them with my family and my kids, my 3-year-old, and we search for chametz together with the bag and the feather and the the spoon and the candle and the so on.
You're saying it's practical. It's basically practical Judaism in real time.
Utmost practical.
Right.
It is the most, like I said, the most authentic, the most close-up version of Judaism you'll ever get. Now,
so what do you think for somebody that's, let's say they just heard what you just said, and they're wondering what's something in Judaism that I might have never experienced that's not as common or that's more rare? What would you say?
So I think the searching for chametz is like a microcosm of that. And then
it's funny when you think of like if you Google like search for chametz, you'll find like paintings of like older Hasidim, older disciples of Rabbis that are they have like their long beard and their strimal or something, and they have like a candle like hunched over, like it's has a stigma or a stereotype of being like this ancient thing that people do, and like people probably don't even know that it's still
and
exists.
it was there's this funny idea that you have to be careful because the anti-Semites, the non-Jews might they see the Jews walking around at night with a candle, they're searching for something, maybe they're looking for their hidden treasure, I don't know, but there's definitely this misnomer, this non-information. And speaking of all the anti-Semitism going on in the world today, I think that 90% of it is misinformation. I think 90% of it is a lack of awareness, a lack of understanding, a lack of sensitivity to Jewish cultural, Talmudic background, contextual background. That once you have that background, and again, I can think of a few examples of things going on lately on different platforms. Once you have that background, everything starts to make sense. Everything starts to work. Everything starts to synthesize. And I think that's a feature of our, Hasidic upbringing. Is Hasidic life is not just about stories. It's not just about analogies. It's not just about cute songs and old paintings and ancient traditions and rituals that nobody knows what we're doing or why we're doing it. On the contrary, all those things are incorrect. We do know intensely and deeply why we do every single small detail of our life, number one. But number two is also this deeper sense of connection and this deeper sense of awareness of this deep Jewish heritage that we have. And I think when we could share that with our fellow Jews and with fellow non-Jews, it really, really, really is the purpose for why we're here.
Well, I think a lot of people, when they think of Jewish heritage, they think of it as either something that used to be more prevalent or something that is not necessarily so much practiced anymore. And I think like you're saying, the way we grew up in this environment was that Judaism is still very much alive, and it matters. Every single thing, like you're saying, like, oh yeah, people don't do this anymore, people don't do that anymore. It's like, no, these things that discussed in the Talmud and discussed in the Torah are still practiced every single day. Like we never lost any part of Jewish practice throughout the years.
Right, and I think that's part one. That is the revealed part of in other words, that part's concealed, unfortunately. It used to be everyone knew that part. Mm-hmm. Then there's another whole element of it, which is completely concealed, which our job as Chabad representatives is to reveal that. And it starts off very esoteric, but it ends up very practical. And that is that everything has meaning. Everything has a significance. So talking about the, searching for chametz, when you go through that house with your feather and your bag and your spoon, you're not just connecting to some ancient ritual and finding 10 pieces of, unleavened bread that we're not allowed to have during Passover according to biblical texts. It's much deeper than that. According to Hasidic perspective, the Hasidic perspective, we are searching within ourselves. So the search is also an internal search as opposed to an external search. It's a search just like unleavened bread represents ego. We're searching for our own ego. We're checking ourselves. We're preparing for freedom. And in order to be free from the boundaries of Egypt, this is all mystical, Kabbalistic ideas, we must, by ourselves, search for our own inadequacies, search for our own, ego problems, and only then could we actually be free and leave Egypt. So this is just a microcosm of one example that we just came up in conversation.
What do you think that looks like practically, though, for somebody on the night before Passover, the night before Pesach? What does that mean?
I can talk for myself.
Yeah.
So for myself, I think that throughout the year, and every part of the Jewish year has its own energy, its own features, its own connection, its own story, its own message. Passover is the holiday of freedom. That is what we call it throughout the texts. That's what we talk about it in the prayers. Zman Cherusenu. It is the holiday of our liberation. Not only the liberation of the Jewish people as a nation, but also the liberation to serve a higher purpose. Essentially, what we did was we went from slavery, physical slavery, to another form of servitude, meaning serving God. So from a physical standpoint, nothing really changed. From a spiritual standpoint, we went from serving a tyrant, dictator, to serving the creator of the world and teaching the whole world by that how to serve the creator of the world, how to make this world a better place, as opposed to just be self-serving. So, back to the question, where do you find, what significance does that have to me personally? When I go to Passover, I am literally thinking about, and this might sound, incredibly, personal, and it is. I think that every one of us, we think about how much baggage and how much crap and how much issues have we gathered or accumulated the last year, and how can we sort of shed some of that? Maybe not all of it. Every year is a new experience, but how can we shed some of that going into the Seder? And then when you sit at the Seder and you drink the 4 cups of wine and you have the mar till we cry, like our dad was always very, very adamant of. You didn't cry by the mar, it never happened. It was a very intense Jewish experience. But that experience, and like every holiday, Chassidus teaches us, you have to prepare for that. You can't just go into the experience and expect to be inspired in Rosh Hashanah or at the Seder or in any sort of Jewish ritual unless you have a deeply internal purpose for why you're doing it and what you're connecting to. Obviously the mitzvah itself has significance, has importance, sometimes maybe more than we recognize. But how much more so if we're prepared for it, if we know what we're getting ourselves into, if we, just tefillin is something which Chabad focuses on immensely for many reasons. Number one is just because it's a practical mitzvah. It's an easy thing that people can do. It doesn't take that long. It's not, doesn't hurt, at least most of the time.
A little uncomfortable for some people.
A little uncomfortable, emotionally and physically. But I think it also, what it lacks in terms of discomfort, or what it has in discomfort, it makes up in terms of spiritual comfort. When a person puts on tefillin, their entire day is different. So the idea of tefillin, there's a beautiful story that I once remember hearing from Manis, but he was at a Pegisha, at a gathering of young students. This is probably in the 70s. This is after the whole hippie movement, and there's hundreds of college students sitting in the room, and he was talking about the significance of tefillin, and how tefillin is a synthesis of the mind and the emotion and the action. And the tefillin goes from above your mind, which represents the subconscious, and it goes into your mind, which is merchen de gadlus, as we know in Hasidic thought. And it makes a person more aware consciously of their own life and the world around them. And then that filters down to the emotions. And you have the arm tefillin connected to the heart, and the heart is all the seven emotions, which we represent going down the arm, all the 7 twirls, chesed, gvura, tiferes, netzach, chayd, yesod. I remember I was in Israel and I had to remember all that. And then finally you get to the arm, the actual, the tefillin goes down to the legs and goes to the extremities of the hand, which represents the most primitive action. And he's explaining all this and the Kabbalistic explanations and the Talmudic explanations. And at the end of this beautiful speech, a kid raises his hand and says, "Rabbi, that was amazing. That was beautiful." He says, "Do you really meditate on all that every time you put on the tefillin?" And the rabbi goes, "Nah, we just put it on." And I think that is the beauty, and that is the essence of what Hasidus really is trying to teach the world. After all of the explanations, and after all of the deep insight, and after all of the intellectual prowess of the Torah and the mitzvot, at the end of the day, pure action, pure dedication is the life of a chassid, is the life of the devout person.
And I think that idea is something that the world probably lacks today most, which is that everyone knows things in theory, right? Everyone has degrees and they're educated, but then when it comes to actual everyday practice, we became, like, the world's become barbaric animals, and we forgot what it means to be moral human beings and just be normal people.
Right, or they don't even believe that there's such a thing as altruism, or such a thing as dedication, or such a thing as loyalty, and they believe that all there is the action. So there's both sides. Some people think the action's lacking. Some people think the action is the only thing there. What are you, a robot? What are you, just following rules? And then you meet the person. You meet this chassid, right? You meet this dedicated person who has such a wholesome and emotional relationship with the Torah, with Judaism, with God. And he's knowledgeable. He knows, or she knows, what they're doing. It's not mindlessness. It's not recklessness. It's not a cult. It's on the contrary, what makes Chabad so fascinating to me, and we could talk about this all day, I'm sure. And Chabad is pretty much our school of thought within Hasidic thought, which is a school of thought within Jewish thought. In other words, within observant Judaism, you have a school called Hasidism, which is the insights, the inspiration of Judaism. And then within that, you had a school called Chabad Hasidus, which in addition to the joy and enthusiasm and passion for life, and for Judaism and for the Torah and so on, the life, the soul of Judaism, you also had the mind. In other words, everything had to even affect the intellectual. So it's not that we focus on the intellectual because it's the highest level. I mean, it happens to be one of the highest levels of a person's psyche. But we focus on the intellectual because if the intellectual could serve God, if the intellectual can realize that there's something higher than its own self, then the world is your, I'd say the world is your oyster, but the world is your matzo ball, right? And everything you want to do could be accomplished because the mind controls the emotion, and now you have something deeper than the mind controlling the mind, guiding the mind, but the mind is still on board. So back to the point is like in Chabad, everyone seems to look at us as all like, okay, you're all the same, and then sort of the inspiration of the everyday rabbi is, and it came from one of our members, one of my friends, and we used to talk a lot, and he was always fascinated how, on the one hand, I'm an individual, I have my own life, I have my own, personal insecurities, interests, hobbies, and so on, different than everybody else, and at the same time, I have this dedication to this message, and to this purpose, and to this book, and to these ideas that really unite us. And in a certain sense, all of society is like that, as a macrocosm. The world, everyone wants the same thing, at least today. I wouldn't argue the same thing 1,000 years ago. People had to come around. But today, everyone wants peace. Most people want peace. Most people want a better world. We could argue that out.
No, the argument is what is peace, but everybody wants
Exactly. The argument was, what does financial prosperity look like? What does peace look like? Right. What does religious freedom look like? And I think that America was also very influential in that Chabad didn't really start to really become successful until we came to America, because as individuals, as Jews, we were stifled by the outside world. We were closed up. We would never be able to have such a platform. And suddenly in the 21st century, we're not only allowed to, but encouraged to share our views and to share our perspectives. And I'm sure there's people who don't want to hear it, and that's okay. But for the people who do want to hear it, or people don't even know it exists, I think this is critical.
So why do you think, there's, like you said, there's different types of Hasidic thought and different types of Hasidic people. There's different types of Hasidic groups. Why do you think that Chabad stands alone in terms of being so popular around the world, and especially in the last 30 years, where we don't even necessarily have a Hasidic leader that's leading the movement? Why do you think that it's been so popular?
So it's interesting, you mentioned 2 points, and I think they're connected. First of all, we do have a leader, and we do have leaders. We have every leader that's ever written or said anything since the time of Moses. Many of those books, unfortunately, are not around anymore. I think it says somewhere that King Solomon wrote 3,000 books. We have 3 of them. So many of the knowledge and wisdom of the world has been lost, at least in its textual form. I think in idea form or in its lifestyle form, it's definitely made its way, through the cracks into society today. But I think that last point is sort of the difference. Is, do you see Judaism as a community, as a culture, as a lifestyle, sometimes even as a racial group or as a nationalistic group? Or do you see Judaism as a perspective and a way of life and a godly, divine way, right? A Tao of sorts that really paints a whole new perspective that, and we could talk about Abraham a little bit, right? Avraham Avinu, Abraham, our forefather, was the first Jew. He was the first prototype of a Jew. And, we talked about this once before, like, what was the world lacking? What was society and mankind lacking that God had to show up to Avram Avinu, to Abraham, and say, it's time for something radically different? And he was living a good life. He was living a godly life. He was living a holy life. He was living a religious life for the most part. But just we can get to that point later. The focus on just community culture is nice. but there has to be something deeper. And you know what? Actually, I will connect it to Abraham. One of my inspirations as a Jew living in Orlando in the 21st century, which, I don't think there's been too many of us in history in that combination. I very, very much tie my own identity to Abraham was the only one. This idea that, Echad Haya Avram, that Avram was the only one in the entire world teaching what he taught. And he also wrote a bunch of books, and he also was, persecuted just like his grandchildren and descendants would be later on, for ideas that may have been controversial at the time, ideas like ethics and morals and, serving a divine creator as opposed to some idol in the shop. This idea that Abraham taught us is still within us, and this is, prevalent in a lot of Hasidic thought, that Avram Avinu, we are all descendants of Abraham. Isaac and Jacob, right? Rachel, right? Rachel, Sarah, Rivka, Rachel, Leah. We are their descendants, and by being descendants of them, we sort of have this genetic predisposition, either transferred through the soul, or transferred through the body, or transferred through culture, or transferred through teachings, whatever have you. But the focus always remains, who are you? What do you represent that if the whole world was against you, that you would still hold true? And unfortunately, we live in a world where most people don't have an answer to that question. They don't know what they stand for. They don't even know their self-identity, right? Their self-worth is tied to their net worth. Their net worth is tied to the market, which goes up and down. So they go up and down. There's no, if you, I like this thought experiment of like, let's say you took everything away from a person, including their money, including their family, including their freedom. You put them in a jail cell, with solitary confinement, for as many Hasidim were, by the way, for different reasons of trying to, promote Judaism at the expense of, the ire of the communists and the Bolsheviks and so on, or whoever have you, the Greeks, the Mesopotamians, the Babylonians. The point remains the same, is that when you're in that jail cell, when you're under your covers at night, or when you're, when you're on a plane, there's no Wi-Fi. Like, what do you think about? Where's your go-to place? What are you representing? When all of the forces in the world are against you and nothing's working, where is that kernel of inspiration? Where's that fire coming from?
But if you think about it, or if you look at past history, I think you'll find, and we know this from the Tanya, from Hasidus, Chabad Hasidus, that if somebody's has a gun to their head, literally, they will 100% of the time, they won't cave in terms of doing the right thing for God. So why is it only for people that are not religious or not observant or don't have Chabad? Why is that true 100% of the time when they have a gun to their head? But for Chabad philosophy, that turns into an everyday occurrence. What's the difference?
So this is basically what we do, and it's fascinating that this is tied into the whole story of the Alter Rebbe, Rav Shneur Zalman Liadi, who had a disagreement with his colleagues, as he had many disagreements with his colleagues. Him being the Chabad practitioner, seeing things through a focal, logical, mindful lens, through the Talmudic lens, through a true lens. And the other students seeing things as, what makes us feel more connected to God. So I think it comes down to this more, feelings versus mindful approach. And the mindful will affect the feelings, but not necessarily the other way around. So famously, there was a disagreement of who should win the war between Napoleon and the Tsar. So the Tsar represented communism, represented, the structure of the Russian, world. And then you had Napoleon, which, for lack of a better term, was really pushing freedom from religion, different than the freedom of religion that we found later on in our Constitution and the American, Revolution. So, the argument was which ultimately is better for the Jews. They're both not great. I think America was great, and America is a whole new shlav, a whole new era. But what was really better for the Jews? And everybody else seemed to say that Napoleon would be better, because with freedom comes, the ability to practice. And the Alter Rebbe seemed to take the other approach and said that there's something that comes from oppression. When there's someone with a gun to your head, when there's somebody who is trying to force you to do it their way, then there's a natural resistance that we have as human beings to sort of say, especially if you're educated, to sort of say, no, I want to do it my way. which funny enough is a more modern way of thinking. I think once upon a time, people, gun to the head, they just did whatever the guy with the gun says. Came along the American...
That would be the case. That would be the case for anything else. I think that is the novelty about the idea, is that if you had a gun to your head, if someone had a gun to their head and the person said, do 10,000 jumping jacks, they wouldn't necessarily do it. But when it comes to having a gun to your head and saying, eat this non-kosher food or do this sin, they won't do it because there's a deep connection to God.
So the question that Hasidus asks is, how could you get to that place without the gun to your head?
Right.
And this reminds me of another story, which same idea, but there was this Hasid who was in those days, I guess in Russia, if they had someone on the loose, they would just round up the whole town and put them all against a wall and basically start shooting until somebody, confessed. So this chassid was probably at the wrong place, the wrong time, and, someone had gotten, stole something, and they rounded everybody up, some culprit. They're looking for the culprit. And they're about to start shooting, and they find the culprit. So later on, he came back to the yeshiva, he came back to his students, and a student said to him, what was it like being under the gun? What was it like being under this pressure and knowing it might be your last moment in life? And you must have been really soul searching and connecting to God in that last moment. And he smiled and he said, it's a lot easier to connect to God without the pressure when you're under a tallis, right? When you have the tallis over your head in synagogue and you're praying with no excitement and no drama, no guns and no Bolsheviks. I think that really was American Hasidism. In other words, I think that today, when we don't have any pressure to be Jewish, when no one's telling us to be or not to be, when nobody even knows what they are, I think that in such a pure, free platform, that's where the true Jew shines. And this connects to an idea I once heard, that, imagine that the Jewish people have been through every single possible persecution, prosecution, blood libel you can imagine, tyrant, dictator, from Egypt all the way, and even before Egypt, Lavan and Esav and you name it. Everything we could have gone through, every trauma and tragedy we could have gone through, we went through. And you would think the 21st century Jew has really been through everything. So he's proved himself to the world. But there was one reality that the Jew never prospered in, and that was assimilation. That was a world where nobody's forcing you to do anything. Freedom to
do what we want.
But true
we haven't
freedom.
mastered.
True, exactly. When somebody gives you free reign, and we all know there's some people who learn great under pressure, they cram for the test, and some people learn great when there's no pressure. And I think that it's natural to cram for a test when you have to. Would you cram for the test when you don't have to? Do you have that desire and earning and yearning to learn when you don't have the test on Friday? And I think that that's really where Hasidus was the most successful, in talking to the American mind of the 21st century. And I do believe that that's why Chabad became more successful in the 21st century than it was in the 18th century, because in the 18th century, people already had, there was a different value to Hasidic thought then. I think then it was really about teaching that these ideas exist. Ideas that today we take for granted, everyone knows, like positive thinking, was very, very much not common in the world, Jewish world or non-Jewish world. The ideas of, democratized workspaces, and the idea that the CEO is accessible, and the idea that people are charitable. All these ideas are new ideas, relatively, in human society. But then you have all these things, and then the let's just call it the 21st century chassid comes and says, you ain't seen nothing yet, because we now have the opportunity to share ideas and to connect with things that we never had the knowledge of. I mean, just the promulgation of information. The idea that we can go on the internet and search for so much. The idea that we can open a book. And the idea that books are printed, right? Before Gutenberg's press, you couldn't write Talmuds faster than people could burn them. And they were burning them pretty fast. Once we had the promulgation of knowledge, and once these ideas start to disseminate, it becomes a viral effect. And that's, I think, what we're seeing. When we grew up, there was maybe a couple hundred Chabad centers. Today there's 5,000 something in the world. There's like another 150 opening every year. I mean, it sounds crazy, but that's how viral things go viral. Is you have a kernel of truth, you have a kernel of authentic wisdom, and you have people dedicated to that because they understand it, because they identify with it, and then they teach their families. I mean, we have there's 9 in our family. I didn't do the math lately, but I think it's 7 of us, right? 7 of us are all community leaders in some way or another. The eighth is in yeshiva studying, so he might make an 8th as well. And how do you create that? And we could have I could bring Dad on the talk show and ask his opinion about how he did it from a parental standpoint. But as children, how do you share that enthusiasm and that passion for life with kids?
Well, I was going to ask. I know if you speak to people that grew up in a religious, observant household, a lot of them will tell you that they were. I hate the word trauma nowadays. But
it's the right word.
We're going to use the word. They became traumatized from the heaviness, the weight of what it meant to be observant, and how much their parents pushed the agenda at home. So what do you think the difference is between us that grew up in a very happy, healthy household home, that we embraced Judaism and all the boys in the family became rabbis and the 2 girls married rabbis? What is that? What component is there to that, as opposed to someone else that ran so far away and wanted nothing to ever do with Judaism again? And their parents might even be rabbis.
And we also thought of running away, by the way.
We did run away. We ran away to Southeast Asia.
Yeah, I think everyone runs away and everyone questions and everyone has this idea that Judaism in any way abhors or limits questions is not only not true, it's entirely the opposite. The whole Judaism is based on questioning. You look throughout the whole Torah, right? Moses is questioning God, the Jews are questioning Moses, Job is questioning God, everyone's questioning everybody, everyone's questioning everything. And I think that's healthy. Ultimately, though, when it comes down to a lifestyle, you have to have what you're comfortable with. And yeah, you might have to go to the other side of the world to experience something else or see people who lack.
But even our quest to find whatever you want to call it, ourselves, the truth, God, in our own little travels that we've done, there was never, at least I can talk for myself, there was never a feeling of what I know is baloney, or what I know is too heavy, or what I grew up with is too hard and too traumatizing. I have to find something else. We were never really looking to replace it. We were just looking to internalize and personalize it. But for some people, they feel like the Judaism that they grew up with is so evil, and that's, I think my question is, why is it such a stark difference in contrast?
First of all, maybe it was a very traumatizing Judaism. I mean, we know people who, there were no questions, there were no answers, and when they did question, they were admonished for it in sometimes very harsh ways. Now, why was that? I believe the rabbis didn't know the answers. And that might sound shocking. The rabbis know everything, or they think they know everything. It's very healthy to not think you know everything. But if you have a person, Rashi in one place in the Torah commentary, he writes this, not that he writes, I don't know the answer. Well, if you don't know the answer, just don't write an answer. But the reason why he wrote, I don't know, is to teach us that sometimes we don't know. It's okay to say we don't know. And,
especially for a leader,
right?
Or a rabbi.
And I always, sometimes people ask me a question, happens often, and I say, let me ask my rabbi. And the first time people hear that, they're shocked. They're like, you're rabbi, you are the rabbi. And I say, I am the rabbi of this community, and I have the scope of knowledge that I have, but there's obviously things I don't know, and I have to ask a bigger rabbi, who may have to ask his rabbi, who may have to ask his rabbi, who may have to actually look in a book of a rabbi who lived many, many years ago, who probably lived his entire life in a little shtetl in Europe, but was able to plow the depths of Jewish thought and came up with an idea that is very practical today in our life and will be the answer to somebody in our life. I think going back to your previous point is, how do you share that? How do you give that over? And the first thing, I remember that there was someone in our shul growing up, and he had the same question. How do I give this to my kids? How do I give my Judaism to my children? And our father corrected him, and he said, no, not your Judaism, their Judaism. If it's your Judaism, you can never give your Judaism to your kids because it's yours. How could you give something that's yours to somebody else? If you give it to them, it becomes them. It becomes theirs. So how do you give them the thirst for knowledge? How do you give them the passion and enthusiasm to live life the way they want to live it, in a way that they see it as their own? And I will say firsthand that I do not do anything. Back to the Abraham example, I do very few things in my life because other people do it. And social media can be very intimidating, and I can see my peers doing things that are, I wouldn't do, either because it's not my style, it's not my personality, or I don't agree. And I was once talking to my mentor, and I said, why is it? I asked this question. I said, why is it that when you go to these big communities, you open up the book and you see what you should do, right? That's the rules. This is what you should do. And then you look outside the book and you see everyone doing the opposite. And then you just close the book and you do the opposite. The way we grew up was you open up a book, you see what it says, it makes sense to you, so you do what it says. Without the peer pressure, without the community distraction. So I think that bigger communities, to a certain extent, and I've had people back me up on this. We have a friend who grew up, a colleague, he went on his own Jewish journey maybe we'll get him on, talking about how he found Judaism, in his own way in Orlando. And he went to many communities after that. He went to New Haven, he went to Miami. But he says there was something so pure and authentic in Orlando that he didn't get that in all the other places. Because he knew that the buck stops here, and that if my kids are going to get any Jewish education, it's going to be from me, because nobody else is teaching them. And I think that is what we grew up with, and that's what we inherited in a certain way, that we cherish, we value the things which are important because we value them, not because somebody else values them.
And I think you kind of just answered my question in two ways, and it's really evident.
We're thinking out loud here.
It's evident. Yeah, it's evident from what we hear. I mean, we've heard everything in the book. When the people, we've had hundreds of people come through our father's synagogue, our father's shul, and
parents' shul, really.
Our parents'
community,
shul, yeah, a community shul. And one thing you hear a lot is, I want a refund. We won't use any names, but my kid went to this in this school in the community, and now he's not religious, or he's married a non-Jew, or whatever he might be. And he's like, I want my money back. I sent it to a Jewish day school, and this is what I get for my money for a Jewish day school, all that tuition. And I think the answer is that, number one, like you said, you can't give your Judaism over to your kid. It has to be theirs. And the only way, they always say kids don't learn by you telling them, they learn by example, right? So if a parent is living by example, and I think this is the secret to what our father and parents did in the home, was that there was no hypocrisy. There was no, do this, and then we see them doing the opposite. You got to keep kosher, and then going out to McDonald's. That didn't exist. There's no such thing. Everything that our parents did, they lived by. It was completely transparent and authentic. And I think the people that may have trauma, quote unquote, from growing up in a religious household, I think a lot of them see, maybe not all, but a lot of them see their parents saying one thing or telling them to do one thing and doing something else. Oh, I'll just send my kid to a Jewish day school and he'll be good, right? I can do whatever I want, but they'll be fine. And the kid always looks back at their parents and say, oh, but you're not doing that, so I'm going to just follow you. You didn't marry properly, or you don't keep kosher, or whatever it is. And I think our parents, there was always this path. We know this famous story of someone that became observant later on in life. He has an incredible story, but he came into the shul. He came into my father, and he said he came to watch. Right? He came to.
I was thinking of this as you were talking.
Famous story that we all know in the family, and he came to shul, and he met a lot of different rabbis, from different sects,
persuasions.
Yeah, and he knew a lot. Very well educated. Did very well in business. He wasn't just someone that was looking for something to fill a void. He was very fulfilled in life. And he came to the shul and he sat in the back watching my father and just looking for any inconsistencies, like many people do. They're always looking for the inconsistencies in Judaism to see that it's not true anymore, or the Judaism from the years ago is not the same as it is today, because now people are just a bunch of hypocrites. And he sat and he came over and over and over again, just watching my father daven, watching him pray, watching him read the Torah, watching him interact with his kids. And he never found any inconsistency. And there was no hypocrisy. And he said, okay, this guy lives, like going back to the beginning of the conversation, everything he does that says that he learns, everything that he preaches, he practices. He practices what he preaches. And that's what I want to be a part of. And now he became observant, and he lives in New York happily.
Right, and sometimes, knowing our Father, I think that even more powerful than practice what you preach is sometimes he wouldn't even preach; he would just practice.
Right.
And you had to find, what does he do when he's angry? What does he do when he's upset? What does he do when things are not going his way? What does he do when, how does he reconcile differences? And in those experiences, and I'm sure we grew up with it, the same way that the daughter of the Alter Rebbe picked miracles off the floor. I think our miracles was to observe how families evolved and how Judaism evolved and how life evolved for different people in different scenarios, including our own. And you're 100% right in that I had the same experience. In the tough times, in the rough patches, how do you deal with that trauma? How do you deal with the issues? And nobody has a perfect life. And I think it's a misnomer to think that anybody could have a perfect life. Even the most righteous people, in some cases, have a much harder life than average people. So there's always this balance that you're always trying to correct something. The Rebbe lived such a powerfully successful life. And then you find out he didn't have any kids. And it blows people's minds, because how could you have somebody who is so successful in every single facet, so perfect? And there's not a lot of perfect people in history, forget about in the world today. I mean, we have a term for such people and it's rare. But then, okay, there's some sort of lack. There's some sort of deep seated issue that they have to deal with. And Moses, same thing. It's very comforting in knowing that, number one. But also, in seeing how you get a resolution and seeing how you reconcile that void. And sometimes it is a void. We're all trying to overcome some sort of human element, because we're human. If we weren't, we'd be angels. We wouldn't be having this conversation. And the Torah wasn't given to angels. God doesn't care about angels as much as he cares about. There's nothing to care about. They're robots. They're programs. They're simulations. A human being, and this goes for every single human being, a human being is a person with their own vices and their own emotions and their own intellectual biases and so on. Getting back to biases, checking those is a whole nother, everyone always thinks, you might think you're right because you think you're right. But what if you're actually right? You also wonder, am I right because I think I'm right? So maybe that was part of our searching throughout the world of what do other people think? Do they think they're right? Do they think that they have this, conviction? And
well, what would you answer to that? Because they do. They do. You go to places like India, you go to places like Thailand, all the different types of religions, and they will tell you that they're right. And so what's your answer to that? We did the searching. We both did the searching, and we both came back home with the same conclusion. So what's your answer to people that would say that they're right?
This is one of my big topics. I love this, and some people, their brains turn off when you start getting into the philosophy and the theology of it. I think that there's a difference between comfort, what's comfortably a conviction, in other words, conviction through comfort, and conviction through truth. Because truth is not something that usually makes you comfortable. If anything, it usually makes you uncomfortable. So if you're too comfortable, you might just be in a situation where you've decided not to question, beyond the boundaries of your comfort zone. I met a rabbi once and I asked him a deep Hasidic question, and he said, in life there are big questions and there are small questions, and I prefer not to ask the big questions. And that's maybe the part of the trauma that people grew up with. We never had such an answer. We never heard, that we don't talk about that. We don't deal with that issue. And either because and people don't talk about it either because it's inappropriate, or they think it's inappropriate, or because they don't know the answer, or because it really is an uncomfortable thought. And Hasidic thought doesn't leave a single stone unturned. And it will literally touch every facet of your emotional, intellectual, and practical life in a way that it will make you uncomfortable. And I think that, there's this idea that, what's the difference between a Chabad tune and a Hasidic tune? There are many Hasidic songs. You could go on YouTube and different Hasidic groups. Everyone has their own melodies and many of them are very beautiful. And I think that that's an aspect we have to appreciate, is that everyone has beauty in their own way. And we're not here to say one way is better than the other way. I think that there's something about Chabad teachings that everybody could learn from, in that it requires a little bit more oomph. It requires a little bit more intensity and a little bit more soul searching. And the Chabad tune, there's always a point. Meir says this. There's always a point where you have to push yourself a little bit more. You have to squeeze your lungs a little bit more. You have to hit a higher note. There's something that makes you uncomfortable. And I think that is the essence of truth. Is that if something, and that's why Moses questioned, that's why Eov questioned, and that's why we question, because we know that we can't be too comfortable in the world because there's always something higher, there's always something more to manifest within ourselves and within society, within the world. And when the world is perfect, maybe we won't have this discussion, we'll talk about that then. But until the world is perfect, the pursuit of making the world perfect, which maybe that itself is a controversial idea, of people trying to make the world perfect. Well, who do you think you are? But that is what we grew up with. We grew up with this idea that we're trying to turn this world from a jungle into a garden, which is the same world, just pruned and, the grass before it's cut to after it's cut. So I think that in summary, we could all learn something that we don't currently know. And I think that's why, again, we were sort of searching, is like, what does everyone else, what do people know that we don't know? And one answer to that is sometimes not a lot. Sometimes we have to appreciate that our grass actually is a greener grass. We have to appreciate that we have a very, very, very rich heritage. And to a Jew listening, I would say explore that heritage and explore that world, because if you don't even know it's there, if you don't even know it exists, and you're constantly looking to other, other circles for your inspiration, maybe your inspiration's in your backyard, as we have many stories of. At the same time, I think that when you have a conversation with somebody and they have a different view than you do, and this is the other side, this is the logical side, this is the Talmudic side of, you have two people arguing and each one is pursuing the truth that they're trying to find. Each one wants to find some kernel of wisdom that they don't currently have, otherwise they wouldn't be talking or discussing in the first place. So when the conversation is over, instead of standing with ego and saying, I am right because I'm right, you ask the question, what is the other side? What is the other argument? And there are many, many books of Hasidic thought dealing with the theological questions, Jewish thought dealing with the theological questions, the philosophical questions, what we were talking about last time, the world, the ontological fallacy and the ontological reality. I mean, there's every one of these could be a podcast on its own, and you could discuss till you're blue in the face. The question is, though, at the end of the day, at the end of every day, what do you go home with? What do you actually take home with you? How has your life changed? And there's this beautiful story of a man who came to the Rabbi, and he said, "What you think of the story?"
Yeah, I was about to say this.
So he says, "What is a chassid?
Oh, no,
what is?
I'll share after.
You'll share after. What is a person who is deemed a chassid? A chassid is this pious individual mentioned in the Torah and mentioned in Talmud and mentioned in Jewish theological and moral and ethical teachings. Who is he? How could I be more like that person?" And the Rebbe said, very simple. If every night you go to sleep and you take an accounting of everything you did that day and you ask yourself the question, how could I be better tomorrow? That's a chassid. And I think that's simply the takeaway, that it doesn't matter what religion you're from, it doesn't matter what way of life you're from, it doesn't matter what your philosophy is. I think if we could all agree on that one point, that we all want to be better tomorrow, 1% better even. Some people want to be 100% better tomorrow morning. That's too ambitious. Be 1% better, be a little bit better. And if you have to go backwards to get better, that's also okay. Maybe not advised, but that's your own way, that's your own path. And everyone has their own path. And some people's paths go in very strange ways. But as long as you have a destination, as long as you're trying to move forward, as long as your objective is to move forward, it's a very, very healthy way of living. And all the things we're talking about, all the trauma, is when you can't do that, when you can't pursue your path, when you can't have the freedom to move forward, when you can't ask questions and so on.
So, it reminded me of a story that one of the musicians from the Rolling Stones once came to the Rebbe in search for meaning in life, even with all his success as a musician of the Rolling Stones band. And he got a chance to meet the Rebbe, and one of the things he told him was, how do we know that Judaism is right? He was at that point, he was exploring Buddhism, and there's many other different religions and ways of thinking.
Right for him.
And the Rebbe said the purpose of a black man is to be a good black man, and the purpose of a Muslim is to be a Muslim, and the purpose of a Christian is to be a Christian, and the purpose of a Jew is to connect to godliness, the essence of the unlimited, of the infinite. And so I think essentially what the Rebbe was saying was, and I think one of the things, at least for me, when I was traveling and searching for what Judaism meant and where it fit in my life, was that I think we wanted to know that Judaism was right for everyone. It's the right way. It has to be that if it's right, then it's right for everyone. And that's not necessarily the truth. The truth is that for a Jew, connecting to God and being a good Jew and being following the ways of the Torah is the best thing for you. And for a Buddhist, it's Buddhism. And it's not that one way is the only way. It's for each person, God created the world in a way, and people of the world in a way that they have to connect to their path, their way. There's different paths for different people. And it happens to be that for a Jew, it's connecting to God, it's connecting to the essence of godliness. And it's not that there's one size fits all, but it's that there's many different sizes, and you got to find your size.
I think today there's a very common, I was just talking to somebody about the famous TED Talk from Malcolm Gladwell about Howard Moskowitz and food science, and how they came up with this brilliant and new age idea that not everybody wants the same stuff. You know, you have your ragu section, and you have your, soup section, and you have different soups for different people who have different preferences. And not only preferences in terms of food palette or taste palette, but also in terms of your body type and your blood type. And there's old ideas, and some of them are more accepted than others, of if you have a certain blood type, you should follow a certain diet. If you have a certain body type, you would exercise, and your fitness regimen will be different than if you have another body type. And you can't always control your body type, your metabolism and so on. There's ways to manipulate it and so on to some extent. But I think that we live in a world today where we realize that people are created different because they're different. And it's okay to be different. It's okay to not have everyone on the exact same page. Otherwise, we'd all be clones of each other. And this is, getting to a whole Hanukkah theme. We could talk about that another time. Is part of the idea of freedom is the idea that each person could have their own individualness, their individual life within the construct of a marriage, right? There's a boundary function between a person and their spouse, within the construct of a family, within the construct of an extended family, within the construct of a community, within the boundaries of maybe a greater community of communities, a city, a state, a country, nationalistic values, right? A continent, a world, right? I mean, everyone talks theoretically about how, united society will become tomorrow morning if the aliens invade from, another planet. Because suddenly we have something in common. And I think that is the core value one of the core values that Judaism brings to the world is that we each have a soul within a body. We each have our own mission in the world. We each have our own objectives, whether we understand them or know them or not. That's our own life journey, is trying to find those, trying to find the reason why we're here. But at the end of the day, if we could all sort of meet at the end and agree that it's about making this world a better place, if somebody doesn't agree with that premise, it becomes very hard to live with them in the same world. Because if someone's trying to leave this planet, right, because they think this planet is worthless, as opposed to people trying to make this world a better place, you have a bit of a dichotomy. But if everybody is trying to make the world a better place and we just don't agree on how to, we can get around that. We could share ideas, and we could come to a newer, higher dimension in living, which is what Hasidus has been trying to do, and I think, I would argue, successfully has done for the last 300 years, and will continue to do in exponential and ever-increasing ways. Because it's not just Jews learning these ideas. It's non-Jews learning. It's people of other persuasions, other religions, right? Atheists and so on, who are beginning to question that maybe it's not just about whether there is a God or isn't a God. The question is, do you want there to be a God? I think that's a much better question of, is there a God? Of course there's a God, and we can prove there's a God, logically. But usually the question is not a logical question, it's an emotional question. When people ask, where was God during the Holocaust, that's not a logical question, it's an emotional question. So when people ask, where is God in my life, that's a rhetorical question that you have to answer. Would you welcome God in your life if he showed up? I know some religious people who wouldn't be interested in what God had to say if God showed up tomorrow morning, because they're so pig-headed, all pun intended, in their own ways and in their own discipline, that they forget how to evolve, and they forget that they may not have all the answers, and they have to rise up and be a chassid and try and yearn to be a better person tomorrow morning.
And I think the world we live in today, much of the world lost the art of being inclusive of individuality. right? It's like not my president, not my this,
Needless
not
to
my
say.
that. We've lost respect for one another because of what we believe, as opposed to saying, oh, you have a belief system and that's beautiful and
Right.
that's nice, and I have a different, and we can still be friends. We can still go out to a ball game. But if we gotten to a point where because we believe different belief systems and different values, it's gotten in the way of being able to get along with one another, and it's an issue.
And you know what that does also, logically, intellectually, is that it creates a confirmation bias for everything that you believe in, because all your friends are confirming and agreeing with everything you say, so it must be the truth, it must be reality, because everybody agrees. But not everybody agrees. It's only your circle of all your friends you haven't blocked on social media yet that are basically mirroring and is it not peacocking, but parroting everything that they're hearing from their social influence. And this is the problem with being so exposed to an outside world. People always look at, Orthodox Jewish life. And I hate the word Orthodox, but I'll use it for this, observant Jewish life. And they criticize it for being so myopic and for being so closed, maybe not myopic, but being, in a bubble of sorts and being protected and having its own ecosystem. From a certain perspective, that's the healthiest thing that we have, is that we block out we block out the negativity. So, and at the same time, we allow in what we need to understand and appreciate. So there's sort of it sounds like a little bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, you have to hold true to what you believe and stand true with it and not let anything persuade you otherwise. At the same time, you have to understand that there are other perspectives. And I think that's the problem. The problem with people who grew up in an ultra-Orthodox world, who are suddenly confronted with this idea that the reality that I grew up with is not reality. It's not so much that they didn't realize, they thought that was the entire world. Their parents never taught them that there's other people in the world, and they act a certain way, but we don't act like those people. We don't act in such a way.
And we accept them, regardless of what they believe.
This is what we got in Orlando, that a lot of Jewish, Orthodox, observant, from Hasidic people, Chabad even, don't have. And I don't take it for granted for one day in my life, because I realized that when I used to go to my friend's house for a sleepover, I took a bottle of milk with me, because we have a special standard of milk. And they not necessarily would hold the standard, probably not. So I would go with my little backpack of my, action figures and my pajamas and a bottle of milk. Do you know how strong that is? And then many years later, when I went to India, I had a backpack with my, basic belongings, right? My passport and my tefillin. And to me, it was the same thing. It's what are you taking with you that's yours? That, a lot of times I was just on one trip, and usually I took my big 55 liter backpack, whatever it was, and I usually took it with me. And one bus ride, I guess it was a very small bus, and we had to check everything. So I said to the guy, I said, I really want to take this backpack with me. I have some valuables with it. He said, just take the valuables out. So I took the tefillin, literally a small little bag of tefillin, out with me, 2 bags actually, and then I took them on the bus with me and went to sleep. We got to the destination, and turns out there was a big box of fish, like raw fish, that had opened up in the middle of the trip, and the entire, everything down on the bottom of the bus was basically covered in fish guts and fish juice, and I had to basically wash the entire thing with the backpack, and it made me secure, it made me comfortable in knowing that I made the right decision, in that if I could take one thing with me, this is what it is. And I ask my wife all the time, if the house is on fire, what do you grab? And for most Jews, if you don't have an answer to that,
Go do some soul searching.
No, yeah, what? So your family, you have to have something. But for most Jews, it was the Torah or the tefillin, or obviously after the kids, the families, people's life, are more important than any scroll architecture artifact could be. But what's the next thing you take? What's the next thing you take? And you really, the reason why I asked this question, because even though it sounds very, survivalist and very, extreme, is because I think it's important that, what really do you value in life in terms of hierarchy? What are the most important things? And, the story of the Maggid, his house was on fire, and he had a lineage going back to King David. And he was crying because he wasn't able to take it out of the house in time, and the fire basically burnt this scroll, text, whatever, family history. And his mother said, "Why are you crying?" And he said, this history is lost. So she said, you build your own history. You build a new family tree. And I think that in order to have that, what are you building? If you're the last man on earth, the last woman, or the last couple on earth, what are you going to teach your kids? What would Noah have taught his kids after the flood? You have 6 people left in the world. 6, 8. 8 people left in the world. 9 with Og, maybe Sichon, 10. 10 guys left, right? You have 1 million of people. What do you teach? What do you say? Your kids are listening. Your kids trust you. You raise them. You have a right to an opinion. Do we have what we could tell our kids that's valuable? And do we have a way to sort of keep a check on what's destructive and what's destroying society?
I wanted to ask, we have this conversation probably 75, if not more % of the time that we talk, it's about this conversation, which is the obvious elephant in the room, which is Mashiach. And going back to earlier conversation that we had today, is that we know the Jews have been persecuted throughout the years. And now we're in a position where we're not necessarily being persecuted. Obviously, anti-Semitism is rising, but we're
surfacing is the word I use.
Yeah,
it's always been there.
But at the same time, we're not being lined up and shot on a shooting squad or being put in cages in a concentration camp. But the obvious question is, this was everything that we've gone through is in order to get to the point of Mashiach. So what if someone would ask you, what are we waiting for? What's taking so long? Where are we on the timeline? Like, what still has to happen in order for us to finally get what we've been waiting for thousands of years?
We really, I was wondering where you're going with that, and we really do have this conversation often, because I think it's the one conversation that people have to be having today of what is that end game look like, and how long till we get there? Like, what's holding us back?
And also, by the way, the second part of that question that I had was, what do you say to people that say, oh, that, like, he's not coming, man. Like, see the writing on the wall. It's like, we've been waiting for so long, and like, how naive are you to think that Mashiach is still coming? Like, come on, dude.
So, I think sometimes when you have such a complicated question, the simplest answer is the right answer. And I think the simplest answer was the one the Rebbe gave us so many times. And it seems to make more and more sense every day that we get closer to the end game, and that the world evolves as it is, even though it doesn't sometimes look like that in real time. Like many things that grow, you have to sort of look at the big picture. And unfortunately, one of the things we're lacking is a big picture. It's very, very hard to see history as a macrocosm and reality as a macrocosm and society as a macrocosm. But you could, if you take a step back and you think about it, about where were our values 4,000 years ago, where are our values today? Where are the government programs of 4,000 years ago versus today? Idolatry versus, no child left behind. I mean, you can't even compare the two. That said, I think that the simple answer is that, and I heard this idea recently so eloquently, is that for thousands of years we waited for him, for Messiah, and now Messiah is waiting for us. In other words, I think the world is ready. I think the world is desperate for leadership. I think the world is desperate for a message, which is why we're doing this here today. The only reason why we're doing this is to get the word out.
Raise awareness.
We're Mashiach energy, and that is the purpose. And as lopsided and as weird and as strange of ways that will happen, it has to happen. Whether it's people going to the other side of the world and realizing that what they have the most important things are in their backyard or in their backpack, or by learning things and by pursuing knowledge. But I think this idea that Mashiach is waiting for us is that even if we had all the tools for making this world better tomorrow morning, would we employ them? Would we do them? We have the freedom that we yearned for 33,000 years, or let's even be more extreme, till 1950. So 3,300 years we waited for this moment, and now we have it, and we're blowing it. We're not blowing it in a way that it's gonna go away and never come back again. We're blowing it in that the opportunity will wait for us until we seize it. And I believe very much in this sort of time loop of life that when you go through a challenge, if you don't rise to the occasion and meet that challenge, the challenge will just keep coming up. Like, I give the example of an Instagram loop. You're sort of on a story loop. We just keep on playing and playing and playing and playing until you either turn it off or address it or pause it or something. I think that our own insecurities, going back to the whole Hasidic idea, we are going to be who we are until we change ourselves. And it reminds me of the analyst who came to Ford many years ago, and he was a planner for the company, and he wanted to tell this big multinational corporation what the next 10 years are going to look like. So he sits around, he has all the board members and the CEO and the CFO and everybody's there, and he says, ladies and gentlemen, the next 10 years are going to look exactly like the last 10 years. And his message was that if you don't change yourself, why do you think anything would change? So everyone is waiting on the world to change. But did you change yet? Did you make a difference in the world? Did you push the ball forward? And if everybody in the world, and this is the Rebbe's radical idea, if everybody in the world pushed the envelope one step, pushed the ball 1 inch, not even a yard, an inch forward, one step at a time, one mitzvah at a time, one person at a time, Mashiach would have been here a long time ago. And I think that the fact is we're stuck within ourselves. We need to have our own personal redemption, geula, insight, breakthrough awareness. Then the world as a whole obviously will have that awareness. And people do go through that in their own personal lives. We go through a moment where like this aha moment of, hey, this is something which I never realized, and I could be more financially successful, emotionally successful, married, happy, whatever, all the things we're looking for in life. But you're the first one to make that decision, and you're the only one who can make that decision. And if somebody else makes the decision for you, it's their redemption, not your redemption. It's their success, not your success. There's a beautiful idea of there was this Chassid who in Hasidic teachings we very much value the beard and having a beard, and the Rebbe wanted this Chassid to have a beard. He was a businessman, didn't have a beard. It was very common in America for American students not to have a beard. So he says to the rabbi of this Chassid, the rabbi of this person, that you should try to influence him to have a beard, but don't tell him it's from me. And this went on for months and months and months. And at one point, they were by a Farbrengen, and they're both slightly inebriated. And the rabbi says to this guy, he says, "Grow a beard already." So the guy says, "Why?" He says, "Because the Rebbe wants you to." And the next day, the guy stopped shaving and started growing a beard. So he came by the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said that he basically explained the story, and he felt a little bad that he had to force the guy, so to speak. So the Rebbe explained that if he would have done it on his own, it would have been his beard. And the fact that you had to tell him it's for me, my suggestion, it became my beard. And I think that this ties back into the beginning of the conversation. Is it yours or is it not yours? Do you believe in it or not believe in it? If you're asking for Mashiach now because some big rabbi in Brooklyn who's awesome wants it, that's not good enough. If you want to go to Israel
it's
because
step one.
It's a good first step, but you have to want it because you want it.
You got to claim it.
You have to claim it and you have to own it. And a lot of podcasts are focused on this point today. So success, self-help podcasts of you have to take the bull by the horns and the buck stops here and do what you have to do. And until you do that, it will just be one thing after another that seems to just be a cycle loop. And some people go through their whole lives and never really fix that loop. And we talk about the proverbial rat race. There's a spiritual rat race, and you're like a rat in a wheel, and you're just going in circles until you break that mold. And I think we grew up in a household of mold breakers, both personally, for their family, for their community, for their entire city. Sometimes even globally. I mean, we have uncles and aunts and who are influential in many circles beyond their own community. And I think when you grew up in that sort of circle, that sort of lifestyle, and what we want to share on this, raising awareness, is you can do it too. Not only you could do it, but you must do it. And when you do it, somebody else will be infected by this positivity bias, by this pursuit of making this world a better place. And number one, if you have enough people, the peer pressure, we always look at it as negative. What if it's positive? What if the whole world starts to get encouraged by this idea that we're trying to make this world a better place? And we all agree on how to do it. It's not just about saving the whales, it's about saving each other and helping each other. I think that that's a very, very good place to be.
All right.